This started several years ago, around the beginning of September 2017. I would occasionally wake up in the middle of the night to strange noises coming from the hallway, and seen strange shadows walk past my open door. As the months went by, they got worse and worse until it happened in September 2018. I was lying on my bed, tossing and turning, trying to sleep with the worst paranoia I've ever experienced. After hours of attempting to fall asleep with no result, I finally decided to go into my mom's room. I slowly climbed out of my bed and grabbed my flashlight, clicked it on, and began slowly walking out of the room, flicking my head back and forth, scanning my surroundings. It seemed to suffocate me. I walked through my kitchen to get to my mom's room, where the clock read 2:15 a.m. I walked straight to my mom's room, just to see my two little sisters already hogging up the bed. Now I know that I'm 14, but sometimes being scared makes you feel vulnerable. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the landing where my sisters run, and I made my decision. I went to Aaliyah's and Olivia's room and jumped in the bed, keeping the lamp on, and finally managed to fall asleep. The next thing I remember, I was sitting up in bed, staring at the black abyss beyond the open door. I slowly whispered 3 times, "I see you." And after the last syllable left my mouth, I noticed a little glass circle in the palm of my hand. It was all fogged out except one little clear circle. I looked through the hole in the glass, and what I saw burned an image in my mind, which I'll never forget. A young boy was standing in the doorway staring at me. He was dressed in an old pioneering outfit with a top hat. His hair was long, shaggy, and black. His long face was pale white. In fact, everything on him was black or white. Everything but his eyes. They were yellow. I immediately put the glass down, and as I did it, it was like he teleported. Because the next thing I knew, he was crouched right in front of my face and pulled the biggest smile. His teeth were the same color as his eyes. I burst awake, eyes wide open, facing the ceiling. I tried to get out of bed but couldn't. I was terrified. My ears were ringing to the point where I couldn't hear anything else. It was so loud yet so quiet. I felt pressure on my chest like someone was pushing really hard. But that wasn't the worst part. The boy from my dream was standing in my doorway staring at me. He wasn't even moving. It was enough for me to panic myself into oblivion. I tried to get out of there ASAP, but nothing worked. After what felt like an eternity, everything snapped back into place. No more boy, no more ringing, no more tension. I could move again. After that experience, I immediately noped right into my mom's bed between the kids already there, and finally fell asleep at 3:15 a.m. I have a story about a crazy ex. He told me he loved me on the first blind date. At one point during the date, the topic of kids came up. I forget exactly what he said, but his response was, "Don't you mean our kids?" There were so many red flags, but he was supposed to be the best man at my friend's wedding, and I the maid of honor. She kept pressuring me to give him a chance. A week later, I told him I was going to class, so my phone was going to be off for the next 2 hours. Afterwards, I turned my phone back on to see I had 10 missed calls and countless texts asking me where I was and why I wasn't picking up. I freaked out and broke up with him over it. My friend called me screaming, telling me I broke his heart and that he was crying his eyes out over me. I stupidly decided to take this guy back. Around Christmas time, I took him to my friend's Christmas party. Before we left, we exchanged gifts. He gave me an expensive $100 necklace and a giant box of chocolates that was almost as big as me. I gave him a $1.25 band shirt from Hot Topic. Other crazy things he did during the course of our 2-week-long relationship. He told my dad when he first met him that he came from a family of heroin addicts and that he liked to drink and do drugs. It was the first time he told me that too. He constantly tried to force himself onto me, even in the presence of others, and tried to sleep with 9 other girls, including my friend, during the 2 weeks. He claimed to love me. My friend and I didn't speak for a year after I finished with him for good because she was so mad at me. I was fired as the maid of honor as a result. Don't let people set you up on dates. It doesn't work out most of the time, at least not for me. About 2 years ago, my friends and I visited Letchworth Village in Rockland County, New York. It was a psychiatric hospital for the mentally and physically disabled, opened in 1911, and was the site of the first polio vaccine trials in the United States. Letchworth was finally shut down in the 90s because of the rampant abuse and mistreatment of the live-in patients. But many of the hospital's abandoned buildings are still standing on campus, and most are decayed enough or already broken into to be easily accessible. The final building we explored was once the main hospital. My friend mentioned that this place was apparently featured on some ghost hunters type show, one of the most haunted places in America or something like that. And we were pretty excited when we saw that someone had graffiti on the walls. "The ghosts are here." The first room had rusted metal bars suspended by wires hanging from the ceiling. This in itself was not out of the ordinary, but as we entered, a gust of wind shook the bars, which began to swing and clank eerily against each other. Needless to say, it was a nice spooky entrance. Upon entering that tetanus trap, we entered a long hallway with a big staircase leading to the basement and the second floor. Ignoring every single horror film-infused instinct to not go down the flight of foreboding stairs into what could very well be the gates of hell, we climbed down to the basement, which of course was extremely dark, except for a welcoming burst of light streaming in from a broken window near the stairs. With our flashlights on, we made our way slowly through the basement hall, and at about halfway, we found the old morgue. One of my photographer friends had set up his tripod and began taking a long exposure of the morgue, as the rest of us waited and jokingly tried to convince him to climb inside of it. As this was taking place, I happened to look about down the hall from where we came. I couldn't make out any details of the hallway, except for the beam of light at the other end. It looked like there was something partially blocking the beam of light coming in from the broken window, kind of like a shadow, but more like a silhouette where a person's upper torso and head would have been illuminated by the light, instead of just darkness. However, the second I noticed it, it moved, and the beam of light was undisturbed once again. Right around that time, my fight-or-flight instinct kicked in, and my bowels went a little loose at the sound of footsteps that came clearly from behind the doors of the unexplored room ahead of us. I can't remember if I screamed, cried, or a little bit of both, but we left there pretty quickly after that. I have to start this off by saying that this was not easy for me to write down. I have tried to do it several times over the past few months, but no matter how it came out, it either didn't sound right, or I got too emotional with it and lost the facts of how I felt about the situation. This happened in February 2017. At the time, I was 18, my sister was 17, and we were living in a small apartment with our dad. We were both in high school. She is a senior, and I was just repeating a class I had failed the year prior. It started off normal, with all three of us heading out at different times to get to work and school. I'd text him a little later into the day to ask him a question, and he let me know he was going to the store after work. For context, my dad didn't have a car. He would usually bike or walk everywhere. Today was a walking day since his bike tires needed air. He got out of work at around 4 o'clock, so I figured that he would be home at around 7, since he was going to the store and all. 8 p.m. rolls around, he's not home. 9, nothing. When it gets to 10, we begin to get worried. We call, no answer. We text, no answer. And this continues until midnight, when the police knock on our door. Once inside, the officer explains that my father was killed by a driver who fled the scene afterwards. Everything that happened after that was a blur to me. I really can't remember most of it anymore. My mom comes up to the apartment later on, since she lived a half hour away. At first, she didn't really understand what happened, since neither of us could really explain. One of the officers took her to the side and explained everything. Every time I try to explain the funeral, my emotions get high, so for your sake and mine, I'll leave that part out. Nothing really needs to be said about it. For those of you into the paranormal, there is a minor experience I had a few days afterwards. Of course, as the angsty teen I was at the time, Every time he would come up to ask me, "What do you want?" And he would always respond with, "$1 million," and hold out his hand as if waiting for it. This was a reference to the song "If I Had $1 Million" by the Bare Naked Ladies. It was playing on the radio during our estate sale. If any of you were wondering if they found the man who murdered my father, he was not under the influence of drugs, alcohol, and he didn't even go to prison. All he had was community service time. There's a reason I can't stand the American justice system. This isn't the first time they've let a murderer go free, and I'm sure it won't be the last either. If you have any questions, I'll be looking around trying to answer them. Thanks for listening. I really just needed to get this out there. I live in this ranch-style house. My bedroom is at the back of the house and has a single-picture window that looks out onto the backyard. The window itself is probably 7 to 8 feet off the ground because the entrance to the crawl space was directly below the window. Also, there's this tree in the backyard that's involved. It's 20 feet from my bedroom window. I don't know what kind of tree it is, but it's an evergreen tree, and the bark can be pulled off in strong bits. I'm around 5'6" tall, and if I'm standing at the base of the tree, the branches closest to the ground would still be over my head. So, these branches that were closest to the ground are at least 6 inches off the ground. It happened in 1998, sometime in late August or early September. It was after school started. I was a sophomore in high school at the time, and I remember it was on a Sunday. My mom dragged me to church that morning. My friend and I had started talking about religion. It was nothing specific about religion, but we were talking about it in general. After church, my mom and I went out to eat lunch. When I got home, my friend called. We continued our conversation, and I took the cordless phone to my bedroom. I was pacing back and forth while speaking to them. I'd take a few steps towards the window, turn, take a few steps towards the opposite wall, and repeat. At one point, I walked down towards the opposite wall, turned to face the window, and that's when I saw this shadow that looked like a person from the neck up. I quickly tried to find something that could have cast a shadow of that shape, but couldn't. Then I realized the shadow had a 3D quality to it, and I audibly said, "Oh God." I suppose it realized I could see it, and it appeared to drop. I ran towards the window in time to see it run across the backyard to the tree. It started to climb the tree. It got to the lowest branches, and it stopped. It stopped climbing and looked at me to see if I was watching it. While it was looking at me, it grabbed a few of the branches. It held the branches for a bit, and then started climbing again. As it vanished, my friend heard me say, "Oh my God," and asked me what was happening. I told him what I'd seen, and he told me to start thinking of God because, according to him, what I had just seen was a demon. A few days later, I go back out into my backyard for another reason. I look at the tree, and it reminded me of what happened. I went over to the tree, and that's when I noticed that the couple of branches this thing had grabbed and was held onto were dead. I could tell these branches specifically were dead because all the needles on these 2 branches were brown, while all the other needles on the tree were green. A few days after that, all the needles from just those 2 branches had fallen to the ground and were laying in a pile. Several years later, while working the graveyard shift as a security guard, I gathered up the courage to call this famous late-night radio talk show and told my story. The host asked me if the eyes were glowing red. I told him no, because this thing's eyes weren't glowing at all. He said that in his experience, if the eyes were glowing red, it was a demon. Otherwise, it was something else. I worked in a really old movie theater for my first job. It was a small theater with 6 screens, all in a line, so you could see from one end of the building to the other. Eventually, I got promoted to a manager, so I had to start the movies. We had film still, so it was fairly complicated. You had to thread the projector and then watch over them because they mess up easily. We always joked about ghosts. A lot of weird stuff happened around there, like falling over, doors shutting, and hearing voices. Well, one day I was there with one employee on a slow midweek day. I walked out of the office, up to the projection booth, and out of habit looked both ways. You know, the old left-right. To my right, there was a woman in a whitish dress with brown hair, about 4 feet away, just standing. I only caught a glimpse of her before doing a double take, and she was gone. I wasn't the only person to see her. Several other employees claimed they've seen a similar woman around the theater. I never saw her again, though. More silly stuff happened, like doors locking behind you or things that were on tables ending up on the floor. Our projectors were old film projectors, and more than a few times, one of us would forget to start a movie on time, only to find it had been already started for us. Another manager claimed that she saw the ghost woman, who was called Sarah, in the window upstairs when she was leaving for the night. One time, we were watching a movie after hours, and we heard a series of what sounded like tin cans fall in succession around the theater walls. There were some rumors that Sarah was a projectionist at an old theater elsewhere, who somehow ended up buried in its walls, and pieces of the building were used in the construction of ours. But we never found any evidence to back up this urban legend. Hey there, hope you enjoyed these stories. If you can, please like and subscribe. I would appreciate it. See you next time.